Ethan Caldwell rarely visited his hotels unannounced, but today, something compelled him to be here. Dressed in his signature dark suit, he moved through the grand lobby of the Caldwell Grand Hotel with quiet authority. Employees greeted him with respectful nods, though a few seemed surprised by his unexpected presence. He wasn't usually involved in the day-to-day hiring process, but for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he had decided to personally oversee today's interviews. As he walked past the conference room where the interviews were taking place, his sharp gaze fell upon a woman sitting on one of the chairs in the waiting area. At first, he thought he was mistaken, his mind playing tricks on him, but when she shifted in her seat, nervously tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, he felt the air leave his lungs. Olivia Harper, a name he hadn't spoken in years, yet it still echoed in his mind with the weight of an unfinished story. She looked different from how he remembered. There was a quiet exhaustion in the way she sat, her fingers gripping the handle of her worn leather purse. Her dark brown hair was neatly pulled into a ponytail, though a few loose strands framed her face, and her clothes, modest yet professional, looked carefully chosen, as if she had put effort into making a good impression. But what struck him the most was the uncertainty in her eyes. He wasn't sure how long he stood there watching her before she was called into the interview room. He remained just outside, listening intently. The hiring manager's voice was polite but firm. "Miss Harper, I see that you're applying for a housekeeping position. Can you tell us about your previous experience?" "I worked as a housekeeper for a smaller hotel a few years ago," Olivia responded, her voice steady but laced with hesitation. "I've also worked as a cashier and an office assistant, but I'm comfortable with housekeeping duties." There was a pause, followed by the unmistakable tone of skepticism from another interviewer. "Your application says you're a single mother. Will your schedule be flexible enough for this position?" Ethan's grip on the doorframe tightened. "I understand the concern," Olivia replied, her voice calm but firm. "I have reliable childcare arrangements. I wouldn't be here if I weren't confident in my ability to do the job." Despite her composed response, Ethan could hear the subtle edge in her tone, the quiet plea beneath her professionalism. She needed this job. He didn't realize how deeply her words affected him until the interview ended and she walked out of the room. She didn't see him, her focus entirely on composing herself. As she left the hallway, he remained frozen in place, watching the woman he once knew slip through his fingers again. But this time, he wasn't going to let that happen. Olivia stepped out of the hotel, taking a slow, measured breath as she pulled her coat tighter around her. The autumn breeze carried a chill, or maybe it was the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. She had done her best in the interview, but doubts gnawed at her. Had she sounded confident enough? Had they judged her for being a single mother? She had learned long ago that people made assumptions about women like her. Employers worried she would be unreliable, as if being a mother made her incapable of working. It was an exhausting reality she had grown used to. Pushing those thoughts aside, she headed toward the nearest bus stop. The sooner she got home to Sophie and Ava, the better. "Olivia." She froze mid-step. That voice. It was deep, steady, and painfully familiar. Slowly, she turned, her heart pounding against her ribs as she found herself face to face with him. Ethan Caldwell stood a few feet away, looking impossibly composed, his dark eyes unreadable. His presence was like a storm she hadn't seen coming. She swallowed hard. "Ethan." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to fade, leaving just the two of them standing in the quiet tension of an unresolved past. "You're here," he finally said, his tone neutral, but his eyes betrayed something deeper. Shock, curiosity, something unspoken. "I could say the same to you," Olivia replied, gripping the strap of her purse as if it could anchor her. Ethan took a step closer, his gaze searching hers. "You're applying for a housekeeping job?" She bristled at the question, sensing the unspoken judgment in his voice. "Yes. Is that a problem?" His expression softened, but there was still something unreadable in his gaze. "No, I just didn't expect to see you here." Olivia let out a short, humorless laugh. "Well, neither did I." The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they weren't saying. The last time they had seen each other, things had been different. She had been different. She knew what was coming next, the inevitable question. Why did you leave? Ethan asked, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. She clenched her jaw. I don't think that conversation belongs here. Ethan studied her, but to his credit, he didn't push. Instead, after a beat of silence, he said, let me give you a ride home. Her instinct screamed no. It would be too much, too soon. She couldn't afford to let the past collide with the fragile life she had built. I appreciate the offer, she said, keeping her tone polite but distant. But I can manage. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. All right. Without another word, Olivia turned and walked away, leaving him standing there. As she disappeared down the street, Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He had found her again, and this time, he wasn't sure if he could let her go. Olivia sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, staring at her laptop screen. The email sat there, open and waiting, but she still couldn't believe it. Congratulations, Ms. Harper. We are pleased to offer you the housekeeping position at Caldwell Grand Hotel. A wave of relief washed over her, so strong that she had to close her eyes for a moment. She had been preparing herself for rejection, already making mental lists of where else she could apply. But this was a lifeline, a steady income, stability for her daughters, and a chance to finally breathe after years of barely scraping by. Mommy! She looked up to see Sophie, her 8-year-old daughter, standing in the doorway in her pajamas, rubbing her sleepy eyes. Behind her, Ava, only 5, peeked around the corner, holding her stuffed bunny. Olivia quickly wiped at her eyes and forced a smile. Hey, sweetheart, what are you two doing up? We heard you moving around, Sophie said, stepping closer. Are you okay? Olivia hesitated for only a second before deciding they deserved to know. I got the job, she said softly. Both girls brightened instantly. Really? Ava squeaked, her sleepy face transforming into pure joy. Really, Olivia confirmed, and before she knew it, Sophie had thrown her arms around her, Ava quickly following suit. Their excitement made her laugh, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she let herself believe things were going to get better. But later that morning, as she dropped them off at school and made her way back home, doubts crept in. Had she really gotten the job on her own? Or had Ethan played a role in it? She didn't want to believe he had interfered. After all, she had been perfectly qualified. But something about the way he had looked at her yesterday, the way he had reacted, made her uneasy. By the time she reached the hotel, she had made up her mind. She needed answers. Ethan glanced up from his desk when the knock came at his office door. Come in, he called. The door opened, and when Olivia stepped inside, his entire body tensed in surprise. He hadn't expected her to seek him out, but here she was, shoulders squared, eyes sharp, and determination practically radiating from her. Olivia, he greeted, standing from his chair. I wasn't expecting you. She wasted no time with pleasantries. Did you have anything to do with me getting hired? Ethan blinked at her bluntness. No, he answered truthfully. She studied him, searching for any sign of deception. You didn't put in a word? Push them to hire me? He held her gaze. I didn't have to. You got the job on your own merit. She exhaled slowly, and some of the tension left her shoulders. I had to be sure, she admitted. Ethan nodded, understanding. I wouldn't do that to you, Olivia. You deserve this job, and I wanted you to get it because of your own qualifications, not because of me. For a moment, something softened in her expression, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Thank you, she said simply, before turning toward the door. As she reached for the handle, he found himself calling out, Olivia? She paused but didn't turn around. I'm glad you're here, he said, his voice quieter now. A beat of silence. Then, without another word, she walked out. And Ethan, for the first time in years, found himself desperate for another chance. The first few days of work were overwhelming, but Olivia refused to let herself falter. The Caldwell Grand Hotel was unlike any place she had worked before. Elegant, enormous, and filled with people who seemed to move at twice her speed. But she quickly fell into the rhythm, reminding herself why she was here. Her daughters depended on her. She couldn't afford to fail. But something unusual began happening. On her first day, as she finished cleaning a suite, she returned to the housekeeping station to find a cup of coffee sitting there, still steaming. She looked around, but no one was nearby. She frowned, but after a long, exhausting morning, she accepted it gratefully. Then it happened again, and again. A neatly wrapped sandwich left on her cart right before her lunch break. A new set of cleaning gloves appearing just as hers started to wear out. Small things, thoughtful, barely noticeable gestures that made her long, tiring shifts a little easier. She suspected Ethan immediately. And yet, when she caught him in the hallway, speaking with the hotel's general manager, he didn't so much as glance in her direction. If he was responsible, he wasn't looking for credit. Olivia didn't know what to make of it. One evening, as she finished up the last of her assigned rooms, she passed the break room and overheard two other housekeepers talking. "You noticed it too, right?" one of them said. "The little things?" the other replied. "Yeah. I heard Mr. Caldwell's been personally making sure the staff is taken care of. He even asked the kitchen to prepare extra meals for us." Olivia froze outside the door, her heart beating faster. Ethan, he wasn't just helping her. He was helping all of them. Something about that realization sent a strange warmth through her chest. She hadn't asked for his kindness. She hadn't expected it. And yet, despite everything, he was still looking out for her. She turned, walking down the hall with renewed determination. For years, she had fought to stand on her own, to prove she didn't need anyone. But for the first time in a long time, she wondered, maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. The days at the Caldwell Grand Hotel were demanding, but Olivia found herself adjusting quickly. The work was exhausting, but it was honest, and she took pride in every room she cleaned, every detail she perfected. Slowly, she started to feel like she belonged. But then, just as she thought she had everything under control, life threw her another challenge. It happened late in the afternoon, just as she was finishing up the last room on her shift. Her phone, which she always kept on silent while working, vibrated aggressively in her pocket. Something about the way it buzzed sent a spike of anxiety through her. She pulled it out and saw her babysitter's name flashing on the screen. Her stomach clenched. Mrs. Porter never called unless it was serious. With shaky fingers, she answered. "Mrs. Porter? What's wrong?" "It's Ava," the elderly woman said, her voice tight with concern. "She's burning up with a fever, Olivia. She won't stop crying, and I can't get her to calm down." Olivia's heart dropped. Ava had seemed perfectly fine this morning. How could she have gotten sick so quickly? "I'll be right there," she said immediately. But as she hung up, reality crashed into her. She was still at work. She had no car. The buses at this hour would take too long. She needed help. And the only person who came to mind was the last person she wanted to ask. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through her contacts until she found the name. Ethan Caldwell. She hesitated, staring at the screen. She didn't want to owe him anything, but Ava needed her. Taking a deep breath, she hit call. The line barely rang twice before he answered. "Olivia?" She didn't waste time. "I need a favor. Can you pick up my daughters?" A beat of silence. Then, "Where?" Surprised by his lack of hesitation, she quickly gave him Mrs. Porter's address. "I'm leaving now," Ethan said. "Meet me at your apartment." Before she could even process the relief that flooded through her, the call ended. For the first time in years, she had asked Ethan for help, and for the first time, she wasn't sure how she felt about it. By the time Olivia arrived at her apartment, she was breathless from running. She rushed inside, expecting chaos, but instead, she found a scene she never could have imagined. The living room was quiet, save for the sound of soft humming. On the couch, Ava lay curled against Ethan's chest, her little face flushed but peaceful, her tiny fingers clutching his shirt. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor, a picture book in her lap, looking up at Ethan with wide, fascinated eyes as he read to her. For a moment, Olivia couldn't move. She had never seen her daughters this calm with anyone other than herself. Ethan glanced up and met her eyes. He didn't speak, just gave her a small, reassuring nod, as if silently saying, "She's okay. I've got her." Something inside Olivia cracked. She had spent so many years believing she had to do everything on her own, that no one else could be trusted, that no one would stay. Yet here was Ethan, holding her daughter, reading to her other, stepping into a role he had no reason to take on. She cleared her throat and stepped forward. "How is she?" she asked softly. Ethan gently adjusted Ava, careful not to wake her. "Still warm, but the fever's not as high as before. I gave her some medicine. Hope you don't mind." She fell asleep almost immediately. Olivia nodded, exhaling slowly. "Thank you," she murmured. "You don't have to thank me," he said simply. "She's your daughter, Olivia. That makes her important to me." Her breath hitched. She wanted to argue, to push him away, to remind him that they weren't the same people they used to be. But looking at him now, at the way he held Ava so protectively, at the way Sophie leaned toward him without fear, Olivia couldn't bring herself to say the words. Instead, she whispered, "I should put her to bed." Ethan stood carefully, cradling Ava as he passed her to Olivia. Their hands brushed, and for the briefest second, she felt the warmth of his touch. As she carried Ava to the bedroom, she tried to ignore the way her heart pounded. But deep down, she knew something between them had shifted, and for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to fight it. Ethan had never been the kind of man who let emotions interfere with his business decisions. He had built the Caldwell Grand Hotel with discipline and precision, ensuring its success by maintaining control over every aspect of its operation. But lately, something had changed. Or rather, someone had changed him. Ever since Olivia re-entered his life, he found himself paying more attention to things he had never noticed before. The exhaustion in the eyes of the housekeeping staff, the struggles of single parents trying to balance their jobs and families, the quiet sacrifices made by employees who could barely make ends meet. And he couldn't ignore it anymore. That's why, during the next executive meeting, he did something he had never done before. He made a decision based on something other than business. "We need to implement a childcare facility within the hotel," he announced, his voice firm as he addressed the board members seated around the long mahogany table. The room fell silent. One of the senior executives, Mr. Bennett, frowned. "A daycare? Ethan, with all due respect, this is a hotel, not a community center." Ethan met his gaze without flinching. "And our employees are the backbone of this hotel. Many of them are single parents struggling to find reliable childcare while working long hours to keep this place running. If we support them, they'll be more productive, more loyal. It's an investment in the people who make this business thrive." Another executive, Ms. Holloway, tapped a pen against her notepad. "It's a generous idea, but it's also costly. We'd have to allocate space, hire certified childcare staff, and ensure safety regulations are met. It's not as simple as you make it sound." Ethan leaned forward. "I'm not suggesting we throw money away. I'm suggesting we create a program that benefits both the employees and the company. Increased retention, higher morale, and a reputation as an employer who cares. Those are things you can't put a price on." Some of the board members exchanged hesitant glances. Mr. Bennett scoffed. "This wouldn't have anything to do with a particular employee, would it?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "This is about all our employees." The meeting ended with no final decision, but Ethan wasn't discouraged. He had built this hotel from the ground up. He knew how to fight for what mattered. And this mattered. Olivia had been cleaning the grand lobby when she overheard the news. At first, she thought she had misheard. A daycare? In the hotel? She stopped scrubbing the glass railing and turned toward two receptionists, whispering near the front desk. "Can you believe it?" one of them said. "Mr. Caldwell is actually pushing for an employee daycare." "Crazy, right?" the other replied. "It would help so many of us. I just don't see the board approving it." Olivia's grip on the cloth tightened. This had to be Ethan's doing. The thought sent a rush of emotions through her: gratitude, disbelief, and something deeper, something she wasn't ready to name. Why was he doing this? Why did he care so much? Before she could dwell on it, another surprise hit her. Later that day, she was called into the manager's office. "You're being promoted to receptionist," the manager said, flipping through a file. Olivia blinked. "Excuse me? We've been observing your work. You're hardworking, detail-oriented, and handle pressure well. We believe you'd be a great fit for the front desk team." Olivia's heart pounded. A promotion meant better pay, a better future for her daughters. But it also meant stepping out of the background, interacting with guests face to face, taking on new responsibilities. She hesitated. Are you sure I'm the right choice? The manager gave her a pointed look. You wouldn't be here if we weren't sure, Ms. Harper. That evening, as she left work, she found Ethan waiting near the hotel entrance, leaning casually against one of the marble columns. You heard about the daycare? He asked. She nodded, crossing her arms. I did. That was you, wasn't it? His lips curled into a knowing smile. You say that like it's a bad thing. She sighed, shaking her head. Ethan, why are you doing this? Because it's the right thing to do. His gaze softened. And because I know how hard you work. You shouldn't have to choose between providing for your daughters and actually being there for them. Something in her chest tightened painfully. She wanted to push him away, to keep the walls up, but he was making it impossible. And the promotion? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You earned it, he said simply. Olivia looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of pity. But there was none, just respect, and maybe something else, something dangerous, something that made her heart race. She exhaled, looking away. I don't know if I can do this. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Why? Because it's a big step. Because I'm scared of failing. He took a step closer, his voice gentle but firm. You won't fail, Olivia. You're stronger than you think. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to nod. For years, she had told herself she didn't need anyone. But standing here, looking at Ethan, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't meant to do it all alone. Olivia was beginning to believe that things were finally falling into place. She had a steady job, a promotion on the horizon, and for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe without the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. The daycare initiative hadn't been finalized yet, but even the possibility gave her hope. But just when she thought she was on solid ground, her past came crashing back into her life. It happened late in the evening, just as she was finishing her shift at the front desk. She had spent the past few days shadowing the senior receptionist, learning the ropes, growing more confident in her new role. The hotel doors slid open, and a guest strolled in. Olivia turned on her professional smile and lifted her gaze. Her heart stopped. Jay Spencer, the father of her daughters, the man who had once promised her the world, only to abandon her when she needed him the most. He looked almost the same, tall, broad-shouldered, with the same cocky smirk she remembered too well. But there was something different in his eyes, something harder, colder. Shock paralyzed her for a moment, but she forced herself to stay composed. She was no longer the scared young woman he had left behind. Well, Jay drawled, stepping up to the desk. If it isn't Olivia Harper. Didn't expect to see you here. Her fingers curled slightly against the desk, but her voice was steady. What are you doing here, Jay? He placed a credit card on the counter. Checking in. Got business in town. Olivia swallowed the bitter taste in her mouth. Of all the hotels in the city, why did it have to be this one? She processed his reservation with efficient, practiced movements, refusing to let him rattle her. Jay leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. So, tell me, Olivia, have you been? You still struggling? Or did you finally get your act together? She clenched her jaw. Don't take the bait. I've been just fine, she said coolly, handing him his key card. Enjoy your stay. He smirked, clearly amused by her composure. I will. Maybe we'll catch up later. She didn't respond. She just watched as he strolled toward the elevators, feeling the ghosts of old wounds stirring inside her. She had fought too hard to let him shake her now. But as much as she wanted to pretend he was nothing more than another guest, she couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling in her gut. Jay Spencer never showed up without a reason. And whatever his reason was, she had a sinking feeling it wasn't good. Olivia barely slept that night. Jay's sudden appearance gnawed at her, stirring memories she had long buried. Memories of heartbreak, betrayal, and the crushing loneliness of raising two daughters on her own. By morning, she had made a decision. She wouldn't let him disrupt her life again. So when she saw him lounging in the hotel's cafe the next afternoon, sipping coffee as if he had no cares in the world, She squared her shoulders and walked straight toward him. He looked up as she approached, his smirk returning. Didn't expect you to come to me. Guess you did miss me, huh? Olivia didn't waste time. Why are you here, Jay? His smirk faltered for a split second before he leaned back in his chair, feigning nonchalance. Told you. I've got business in town. She crossed her arms. Cut the act. You never just show up without a reason. So what is it? Jay sighed, setting down his cup. All right, fine. I heard about you. About how you're working at this fancy hotel now. Thought I'd see for myself how my old girl was doing. His words sent a shiver of anger through her. His old girl? He had no right to claim anything about her. I don't need you checking up on me, she said firmly. You lost that right years ago. Jay chuckled, shaking his head. Still got that fire, huh? But tell me, Olivia, how are my daughters? Her stomach twisted. You don't get to ask about them, she snapped. You walked away, Jay. You left me to raise them alone. Don't act like you suddenly care. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, something almost resembling guilt, but it vanished just as quickly. Relax, he said, holding up his hands. I was just curious. Well, don't be, she said sharply. They don't need you. I don't need you. She turned to leave, but his next words stopped her cold. Does he know? She slowly turned back. What? Jay gestured vaguely toward the hotel. Your new boss, Ethan Caldwell. Does he know you've got 2 kids? Does he know what kind of mess you come with? A wave of fury rose inside her. Who I am and what I've been through is none of your business, she said, her voice shaking with restrained anger. And if you think you can waltz in here and intimidate me, you're wrong. I've built a life without you, Jay. A good life. And I'm not letting you ruin it. Jay stared at her for a long moment, as if seeing her in a new light. Then, to her surprise, he smirked. Well, damn, he muttered. Guess you really did get your act together. She didn't reply. She just turned and walked away, her heart pounding. For the first time in years, she had faced Jay without fear. And it felt good. She wasn't that scared, abandoned girl anymore. She was Olivia Harper. A mother. A fighter. And no one, not even Jay Spencer, would take that away from her. The weight that had lingered on Olivia's chest for years suddenly felt lighter. Jay's presence in the hotel had stirred old wounds, but standing up to him had done something even more powerful. It had closed a chapter she never thought she could truly end. She no longer feared him. She no longer needed his approval. She was free. That weekend, Olivia decided to do something she hadn't done in a long time. Spend a day with her daughters without worrying about work, money, or the future. Cheryl and Ann squealed with excitement when she told them they were going to the park. The simple outing felt almost indulgent, a rare moment where she allowed herself to just be. Not a struggling single mother, not a woman fighting to survive, but a mother enjoying her time with her children. They ran across the open grass, their laughter ringing through the air. Olivia watched them with a soft smile, her heart swelling with a peace she hadn't known in years. For so long, she had been in survival mode, doing whatever it took to provide for them. But today, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. And that was when she heard a familiar voice. You know, I think this is the first time I've seen you completely relaxed. Olivia turned, startled. Ethan stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, a warm expression on his face. She blinked at him, surprised. What are you doing here? He smiled. I was in the area. Thought I'd take a walk. His eyes flickered toward Cheryl and Ann, who were chasing each other around a tree. I didn't expect to run into you, but I'm glad I did. A breeze brushed through her hair as she studied him. He wasn't in his usual suit, just a casual button-down and jeans. It was strange seeing him outside of work, but it also felt easy, natural. They look happy, Ethan said, nodding toward her daughters. Olivia exhaled softly. They are. And for the first time in a long time, so am I. Ethan tilted his head slightly, watching her. That's good to hear. There was something unspoken in his gaze, something that made her pulse quicken. She wasn't sure what it was, but for once, she wasn't afraid to find out. The sun was beginning to set, casting golden light over the park. Olivia and Ethan sat side by side on a bench, watching Cheryl and feed ducks by the pond. It was peaceful, and yet there was something stirring in the air between them, something neither of them had fully acknowledged, but both could feel. Olivia glanced at Ethan. "I never thanked you properly." He raised a brow. "For what?" "For everything," she admitted. "For hiring me, for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself, for the daycare proposal, even if you won't admit you did it for me." Ethan chuckled. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." She smiled. "And that's what makes it mean even more." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt full of possibilities, of words left unspoken, of something new on the horizon. Ethan shifted slightly, turning toward her. "Olivia, can I ask you something?" She met his gaze. "Of course. Do you ever think about the future?" Her breath hitched slightly. For so long, her future had only ever been about survival, about making sure her daughters had what they needed, about working hard enough to keep their world stable. But now she allowed herself to imagine something more. "I do," she admitted softly. Ethan nodded, as if he understood. He didn't push, didn't rush her. But Olivia saw it in his eyes. He was giving her the space to decide, to choose. And maybe, for the first time, she wanted to. Cheryl suddenly ran up to them, pulling on Olivia's hand. "Mommy, look. The sky is pink and orange." Olivia smiled, brushing her fingers through her daughter's hair. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Ethan stood, glancing at her before holding out his hand. "Walk with me." Olivia hesitated for only a moment before placing her hand in his. As they walked toward her daughters, toward the fading sunset, she realized something. Ethan's presence in her life had never been about charity. It had never been about obligation. It had been a choice. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, something real, something that wasn't about the past, but about the future. And for the first time, Olivia was ready. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this entire story and watch the video. I truly appreciate your support and attention throughout this journey. If you enjoyed the story, please don't forget to hit the like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share it with your friends who might love it too. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so you won't miss out on more exciting content coming your way. Your support means the world, and I can't wait to bring you more stories. Stay tuned for the next adventure. Thank you once again, and see you in the next video.